Hello everyone. So today I'm going to show you how to apply materials to your model. I've just finished UV mapping it, and so now it is ready to have some textures. So to start out, I'm going to close out my UV editor. I don't need that right now, but I'll need to pull it up later. I have a lot of history here, so I'm going to go ahead and delete it by hitting this button, delete to history, and get rid of all that extra data I don't need anymore. Now I want to go up to here. I'm going to click this button. It is the little blue circle, and it will open my Hypershade window. And what the Hypershade window is basically it is a node-based editor for setting up our materials. So what are materials? Materials are basically a collection of images and different values that we put in to basically compile a surface on top of our polygons. So to create a material, we can, in our Hypershade, go up to Create, and then it gives us all these options, and we're not going to worry about all these. We're just going to go down to Arnold Shader Surface, and we're going to hit AI Standard Surface. And that'll create a new material in our little material window here. And I'm going to go ahead and give this a name. I'd like this first material to be the handle of my axe, so I'm just going to call it, say, M_leather. Another way to create a material is I could select my model, and then I could hold right click and go down to Assign New Material. It'll pop up this window, and from here I will go to Arnold, and I will select AI Standard Surface from here. And let's just call this material M_metal. Now that I have two materials, I can see they are both in my node editor down here. If I want to just look at one of them, I could select my metal material and then hit this button here. This will basically show the input and output connections of whatever material I have selected and nothing but those. So if I click it, it gets rid of my leather material and just shows me the metal. If I want to clear my window here, I can just hit Clear Graph, and it cleans it up. I'm going to go ahead and bring back my leather with the input and output connections button. Voila. And let's give it a color. You could manually input a color by using this slider, this input field, something kind of a teal, but that's obviously not what I want. What I want is to use an image. So to use an image for any of these attributes, you can click the checker box here, and that will open up a window to create a render node. And there's a lot of options for that as well. For now, we're only going to worry about File. So you click File, and it'll make this node that is connected to the base color of your material. And in this node, you can put in a file. I have already found textures that I want to use off of the internet. Textures.com is a great resource for finding seamless textures. For this sort of thing, you want to make sure you're finding seamless textures so you can make them tileable. We will go into that more later. For now, I'm just going to select my brushed stainless steel albedo texture. It is a .tiff file, but it could take JPEGs or PNG files. I think GIFs should probably work as well. What is an albedo? That is just a fancy way to say it is a color. So I got a color for the, or I've got an albedo for the leather. I've got some albedo for wood, that sort of thing. You'll often hear a couple different names for a file that just means it's color. Sometimes it'll be base color, sometimes it'll be diffuse, and there's some minor technical differences, but ultimately all means the same thing. It's color. So I'm going to grab my leather albedo. I'm going to hit open. It puts the file name in here. And now it's a little bit hard to tell from the preview because it's a pretty dark texture. But now it is applying to this preview. I'm going to go back into my leather material node. Do the same for the roughness. Click the checker box. Hit File. I'm going to go to Leather Weave Roughness. Open that. So now, if you can see, the light is very reflective. It is very low roughness in these portions of the material. But when you get to these lines, the light is very scattered. The way a roughness map basically works, it is a black and white texture. I'll pull it up again. So basically, a roughness map is where the darker a portion of the texture is, the shinier and less rough it's going to be. Whereas a lighter portion, closer to white, is going to be rougher. And it will scatter the light on your surface. So now that I've got my color and I've got my roughness, the last thing for me to do is to add my normal map. So I'm going to go down here to the Geometry tab. Open that up. I'm going to go to the bump mapping input field, hit the checker box, hit File, and I'm going to go over here to my File node. I'm going to pull up my normal map. So what is a normal map? To put it very simply, a normal map is basically a way to add further detail to your mesh. So you'll notice that normal maps will come in all these different colors, and each channel on your normal map, the red, the green, and the blue channel, represents the way your model would be lit from different perspectives. And it combines them all into one texture, and then it uses all of those channels, the red, blue, and green, to simulate detail as if it had more detail from those different angles. So I'm going to open that up, and then make sure in your bump 2D you have it set to tangent space normals. There's multiple ways to fake detail on your materials, or another method would be with a bump map, and you would just leave this as bump. A bump map works similar to a roughness map, where it simply raises or lowers the simulated detail using a grayscale image. It works similarly to a normal map, but not quite the same. So if you were to find a bump map, or a height map as it's sometimes called, on the internet, you could use that too. Just make sure you're using bump. So, and now with my normal map applied, so it's a bit of a subtle effect, but you can see how it is adding some detail to the way the light is bouncing off of my material. The effect is especially prominent in the crevices. You can see how it is lighting up in here now, whereas it wasn't before. Okay, so I've got my leather material, but now what do I do with it? Well, I'm going to go over here, and first I want to make sure that textures are on in my viewport. To do that, go up to here and click this button right here. It looks like a checkerboard wrapped around a ball, and it will show your textures. We won't see it right away, but then once you apply material, then we'll see how it works. So I'm going to go over here, go into faces mode, select all these faces, and then with all of my faces selected, I'm going to hold right click. I'm going to go down here to assign existing material, and then I'm going to select my leather, and it's there, but it's very dark. It's a little bit hard to tell right now, but it is on there. So how do we get a better view of our texture? One way we could see our texture better is to go up here to this box labeled gamma, and we could simply raise it to something like 2, or maybe even 3, and we can see our texture a lot better that way. Similarly, we could do the same thing with our exposure and raise it up that way as well. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple of lights to the scene so that I'm going to close this for now. And then in our shelves, I'm going to move over to the rendering shelf. Click that. And here we have a lot of different options for lighting our scene. I'm going to add a point light for now. Move it over here. And then once my light is in my scene, I'm going to go over here and turn up the intensity to the max. Normally we might play with the exposure of our camera, but for now we're not going to deal with that. And then once we have that, we can turn our lights on by clicking this light bulb next to the textured button. So you turn that on, and it blows out most of the acts, but down here where we need it to be lightened up, you can see now that we have our texture. If I'd like another light, I can hold shift and drag this around to the other side. Now you may notice there's something very wrong going on with our texture. There's this big ugly seam down the middle that doesn't make sense because they should be symmetrical. So why is this side dark? Why is this side light? Well, there's one more step we have to do for our normal maps to make sure it looks good. So going back into our Hypershade, we can go back down here to our normal map texture file node, and in our color space field, I want to change this from sRGB to utility raw, and that will fix the texture and make it so that it fully understands what it is looking at when it looks at the normal map. Then we can come back to here, and it has fixed our seam. And now it looks pretty good. So I'm liking how it's looking for the most part, but it is pretty big. I'd like to make this texture smaller on my model. So there are a couple different approaches we could do to this. First and foremost is I could go into my UV editor and I could change the UVs themselves. So I've got just the handle as its own couple of shells. And if you remember, if we change the scale of this, it changes how the texture is represented on the model. Now, because the leather is its own material, it's okay that it overlaps other UVs in this context. And now we can see the texture looks a lot smaller. I can move it over to adjust it on that seam a little bit. And it looks pretty good on one side, not necessarily the other. You can scale it a little bit and just keep tweaking it until I have just about erased this seam entirely. And that looks pretty good. It's a little bit stretched out in some spots, but I could go back and change that later. For now, I like the way this looks. Remember to be aware of how you are overlapping UVs. You wouldn't want to do this if your whole model was going to use one material. because then all these metal parts would be overlapping with your leather parts, and that would cause a problem. But in this context, where we're using different materials for everything, it's okay for things on separate materials to overlap with each other. But let's say that that's not quite good enough. I want to get this texture to be even smaller. I could go into my Hypershade. And if I have a seamless texture, then this works great. I can go into this Place 2D Texture node, and I can go down to Repeat UV and give it a new value. Let's say 2 and 2. And what that simply does is it repeats the texture in the same space twice over. So you can see in the UV map, the color has repeated and it now looks smaller. And my texture, or on my model, and then on my model, you can see the same thing. The squares are now a lot smaller. I can then attach this node to here and here and just get rid of these nodes so that they're all sharing the same information. And now my normal map and my roughness map match the same size as my albedo. And so going over here, it now looks very small. But I think it's a little too small for my taste, so I'm going to change this back. If I want to deal with this last bit of stretching, I can go into my face mode, grab these faces. If I want to fix some of this stretching problem, I can select these faces. And then I can move them around. And just sort of manually adjust these UVs. So that they look a little bit more like I'd like them to. And there, that looks a little bit more even. But now it is reaching outside of my 0 to 1 grid scale. So I'm going to scale this down a bit. And there we go. Moving on, I'm going to go ahead and work on my metal texture. And that's going to apply to most of the model. So I'm going to grab all of this, making sure to leave out the handle. I'm in UV shell mode to make it a little easier to grab everything I want. And okay, and then I'm going to hold right click and go down to assign existing material, hit metal. I'm going to close this for now, open up my Hypershade again. Select my metal texture and hit input and output connections. All right, and then in here, same thing as before. Color, find my file, albedo, open that up. Same with the roughness, hit file, metallic. Scrolling down to geometry, go to my bump mapping. Get a file. And then this time, I have both a normal map and a height map. So I have a choice here. To show you both, I'm going to go ahead and use my height map. I'm going to open that up. And the bump 2D already recognizes it as a bump map, so I'm going to leave that alone. And similarly to the normal map, this just fakes some level of detail on the model. Now I know right away I'm going to want to tile my texture, so I'm going to attach the Place 2D texture node to all of these files. Put them together a little bit, and then in here I'm going to repeat UV, let's say by a value of 4. Repeating UVs is really great for when you have really low quality textures and you want to get a lot of detail out of them. As long as they're seamless, you can get very high detail out of some not great textures. Now, for whatever reason, this height map feels pretty extreme. I'm going to grab these lights here and duplicate them. Just kind of be sure. Yeah, this height map is very extreme for what I want to do. Notice when I have my lights selected and created, it added them to the node graph. You can clear it away with this button, clear graph, and select my metal. Grab the nodes again. Take note that when I reopened the material in the node editor, it reordered my nodes, but they're still the same. So just pay attention to where they may have ended up. So because this height map is pretty extreme, I'm going to go to my bump 2D node, and I'm going to grab the bump depth and drag it down. As you can see in the preview, it looks a lot less noticeable. Then there's one more thing I can do. This doesn't really look like metal yet, and we can easily achieve that effect by just going to the metal node and sliding up the metalness slider. And it doesn't necessarily have to go all the way, but I'm going to push it all the way. And we now have a in our preview, it looks very metallic. But over here, now it just looks like a big void. That is because the viewport does not render this image fully. This is only a preview of what we're actually going to get. So to actually see what this material will look like, we'll need to render an image. We will go into rendering in depth in the next class, but for now I'm just going to go up to Arnold and I'm going to hit render, and that'll open this up and it'll start rendering an image. It'll be very grainy at first, but then it'll load it in over time. And just to really see, I'm going to drag one of these lights really close in. And give it some time. And I'm still really not happy with that bump map. It's really giving me a lot of extreme distortions. I can try and reduce it even further. Give it a value of 0.01. And there. Now that looks a lot more like I would expect it to look. It's pretty difficult to work with this, though, in the viewport. I don't want to have to render an image every time I want to see what my texture looks like. So for now, I'm going to turn my metalness all the way back to 0. And now I can see more accurately what the texture looks like. I'm not really into the direction these textures are going in. So I'm going to open my UV editor up again. And I'm going to start playing with those UV shells. So I'm going to select here. I'm going to rotate this around. About there. I want the grain of the metal to go along the direction of the blade. So about there looks pretty good. I'm going to do the same for here. Just kind of rotate it this way. Because I'm using textures I found off the internet, I'm not going to get a perfect curvature around here. If I wanted a texture that went around this perfectly, I would have to use Substance Painter to design something. But we are saving that for the next assignment. So if you're not totally into the way these textures look, that's okay. We will learn how to become much better texture artists in our character assignment. Alright, but other than that, this looks... Well, I'm not quite happy with that. Let's see. Because of the way I have laid this out, it is creating kind of a weird curve on the surface of this. So I think I'm going to make a bit of a change. And it's kind of up to me to explore how I want to address this exactly. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to try out something. I'm going to make some cuts along here. I'm going to go up to here. I'm going to hit unfold. And I'm going to rotate this around. Get it so they're pretty close. I'm going to hit stack and orient. Well, it's still not quite right. I think I can just eyeball it though. Get it pretty close. There, and that's a bit better. Grab these lights, hold shift, drag them down to clone them. So get a look at these. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it's better. I like the direction that's going in. And then finally with my blade, I will rotate this around as well. Laying up so the curvature goes along this outside edge. And I'm just going to rearrange these so I can try and get everything to fit back in that 0 to 1 grid space. I might take a little trial and error. That's okay. It's all part of the process. Alright, I think I'm going to make this a wood texture to kind of break up the colors a bit because we have a lot of the same metal texture. So once again, I'm going to hold right click and I'm going to assign a new material. Go to Arnold, make this an AI standard surface. Then I'm going to open up my Hypershade. Select my AI standard surface, give it a new name. I'll make it M_wood. Click this button. And I'm going to go through, do the same process. Select File. Grab my wood albedo. Grab my roughness. Go to geometry, go to bump mapping, file. In my bump, make sure I'm going to use the tangent space normals. In my file, I'm going to grab my normal map. And then the color space, I'm going to go to utility, raw. That should do it. And over here, looking at my handle, and over here I can see that the grain is not really going the direction I want it to go. So I'm going to go to my handle UVs, scale them up. I'm going to rotate them. If I rotate while holding J, it will rotate in increments. And I can get a perfect 90-degree angle. And there we go. That looks pretty good. Adjust it a little bit. Try to make it a little less obvious. You can see that it's mirrored still, but it's not too noticeable unless you're looking right here. And then finally, we're going to do our emissive texture. So I'm going to grab the UV shells at the top here. I know I'm going to want to scale those up. And then I'm going to assign a new material. Go down to AI standard surface. I'm going to call this M_crystal. And then in here, I can apply all the same things as before. But what I really want to start with, though, is my emission tab. So in here, emission will basically make the material glow. So I can go in here, select a color. Let's just start with that and give it a weight. 1 will make it glow a little bit, but I can go past the slider, give it a value of, say, 10 or even 20. And it'll go a lot more. It's hard to tell in here what it's really doing. So once again, we're going to go to Arnold, Render, to render an image. And as you can see here, it is really glowing in the dark. It is not taking in any shadows, and it is lighting up the metal around it. We can even go further, give it a weight of 50. That'll make it glow even more. I can just keep going if I want. 200. And I'll just get higher and higher. If I go in, I can even still add my color. So I've got, this is ice cracked, little printed. And because my mission is so high, it's kind of overwriting the color. You can't really see it. So what I might have to actually do is go into my color of my emission. Go to File. Select the albedo again. No, that's for the wood. So I've got my texture applied, but it's still being washed out by the weight of the emission. So I'm going to knock it back down to about 10. And now it's bright enough that you can see it's glowing, but it is not washing everything out. Don't forget, if you turn down your metalness to work with the texture, you can turn it back up by sliding up the metalness value. And there we go. There is our textured axe. You won't be able to really tell because now we turn the metal list up, but once we do a render, this will look really good. So, thank you all for watching, and next we will get into the full method. And then next week we will get right into actually rendering high quality images of this axe. So until then, have a good one, and I'll see you later.